This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm Patrick Gulo.
I'm Nate Blyton.
And I'm David McDonald.
And today we're happy to have with us today is Brian Groder, trumpeter and composer. He has sort of explored this region between jazz and classical, something that Dave was actually talking about right before the show. We'll be talking about improvisation, fluid density, a new project that has come out from Brian. There's lots to discuss. I think the most intriguing thing, though, is I want to start off with this idea of the space between classical and jazz. And Dave, I'm not sure if you want to pick this up. What exactly did you mean by that? And Brian, how do you handle this part of your career, like wearing these two hats?
I'll be happy to start.
Go for it, Brian.
Well, jazz at its essence is improvisation. Improvisation that's probably based upon the Afro-American blues tradition, and I think that's what gives its jazz tinge to it. European improvisation has tended to not be focused on the blues tradition, and so their music renders itself more to a strictly improvisational element, and I think that's closest to the idea of classical improvisation. And of course, as you are all familiar, as your listeners, classical music has a history of improvisation inherent in its foundations, right from Bach and before. And so I think there was a time maybe when musicians and audiences weren't aware of improvisation in the music performance. And I think what's exciting is that is a very large element nowadays in new music, classical music. It's embracing the idea of improvisation as part of the story to tell. And it's just not myself. There are many other so-called jazz musicians, improvisationists who are exploring this. Uri Cain and Dave Douglas came out with a release last year. Matt Maneri has also done projects with that. So there are many wonderful musics here in New York and around the world who are embracing this concept of introducing and using improvisation in classical music.
Do you like to
go ahead, Patrick?
Just really quick? I mean, to get this out of the way, I mean, would you introduce yourself as a jazz musician, or do you prefer like musician or composer, or do you not really appreciate the idea of a label because it can kind of?
Well, I don't get worried about it. People can call me anything they want, and they do sometimes to my face, they say. I come from a family of musicians. Both of my parents are musicians. They met in the heyday of live radio orchestras here in New York City. My father came from a more jazz interest. My mother played mallet instruments, marimba, xylophone, and she was more classically based. So I was fortunate growing up in my home that I heard an enormous range of music and was totally accepted to listen to one after the other, and it was all something to listen to and discuss, embrace, and to explore. And so to me, it may be an entry point for someone who is not familiar with my background. They may listen to a more jazz-based release that I've been on, or fluid density. So it comes from different sources for them. And I don't care. I try to portray myself just as a musician and a composer.
Yes. And you just mentioned fluid density. This is your release from last year in February. Could you tell us a little bit about this project?
Yes, I met a wonderful Sicilian pianist who lives here in New York, Tonino Miano, who has an extensive background in 20th century piano music, and we just started a conversation and a musical conversation dialogue of improvisation. And it was something that was right from the beginning, where we could just keep on going in different regions and explorations when we were playing together. And so to harness that and try to bring it down into little bits of 5 minutes, 4 minutes, and keep ourselves from just playing for 30 minutes and keep it focused, we sort of embraced those certain concepts to do that, and yet to improvise freely. And that was the release Fluid Density, our first. And I'm happy to say that we have started rehearsing and researching source materials to do a second release recording. And it was very well received in both the so-called jazz improvisational camp, as well as the new music classical magazines and blogs.
So what is so you say you're rehearsing these improvisations. I'm curious the extent to which these works are structured in this album and in the next one.
Very good question. On this last one, Fluid Density, let's say there was some technique or some chord voicings or movement that Tonino really found an interest in. And not necessarily that he's memorized a specific sequence, but he wanted to investigate an improvisation with that. And so we'd use that as a basis. And so we would we would investigate performing together different scenarios, different combinations of putting together some kind of overall arc of presentation for improvising. And if we would say, oh, this is successful, so this is something that we want to include on the recording. And we try to do many approaches, and many different key centers, so it doesn't all sound the same. And make sure that we identify that tempos, so that each individual piece would lend itself to listening to, and the entire album would have an arc and individual stories to tell, and not just one gigantic story where it's just meanders around, and we didn't want to do that. And I think we were successful in doing that. We have a lot of communication with people that have written to us, and they said, oh, they really like this track, we really like that track, and we wish that went on longer, or you investigated that more. And that made us feel good, because we feel then, oh, we can go more into that realm, or that it succeeded in what we were trying to portray. And not only Tonino, but I would bring things that I had been working on in trumpet technique or melodic phrases. And then, of course, there are actual individual pieces of historical music that we both love, that we're using for the basis of improvisations. Some of the material didn't make it on this recording, was Bartok's music. That Tonino and I both love, and we investigated. We were just not, we did not think it was the strongest material to include on the CD, so that's always something that in consideration when you're compiling and listening back to all the audio tracks from a recording.
It's killing your darlings.
No, it's just being honest and saying this isn't the strongest, and we need to work on that some more and find another angle of attack, or we just need to define what we're trying to say on it. Sometimes it's better to take just a couple of measures, or just an individual section of a piece, and say this is what we're going to focus on improvisation. I know a lot of people, including reviewers, probably didn't believe us when we said the entire album is spontaneously improvised. While we had some certain ideas about what we were going to record and what we were going to work on in individual tracks, there was nothing per se actually written down in musical notation at all. And we feel good that people don't believe us, that they think that it's something that we were actually reading down score-wise in certain areas.
I think
So
it does have a lot of that focus that you were talking about, and you know, I'm sure setting out those techniques and styles and tempos and key areas and things that you wanted to focus on really helped keep each of these pieces nice and concise and well. They're really well contained for improvisations, which is something, you know, when you listen to people who are in this space and maybe used to playing other kinds of music, they're not used to having to think compositionally about a larger thing. And so they have these kind of moment forms where each thing is just a new idea that's not related to the stuff before it and isn't related to the stuff that comes after it. But I think, you know, you've really kept these nice and like I said, concise, and to use your word, focused in these shorter works. So I'm sure that planning that you did really helped out.
thank you. I think it is important to rehearse together. It's the nature of the music that we're approaching and trying to do here is we're not like playing down ahead of a jazz composition and then just improvising either freely or over specific chord changes. That's not this. You have to really feel that you've explored it beforehand and know where you can go with it, and then try to to document that. Of course, sometimes you can just have those golden moments where you pick an area and just go with it, and it just flows. And those, of course, magical moments, and you're happy that everything was recorded and the tape was rolling and the engineer got it all.
Absolutely.
And what is your cat's name?
We have two cats.
Okay.
We have Noogie and Nashi, and yes, they may be flowing in the background here in the so-called practice media room here, which also serves as our bedroom.
Nice.
Cats and SoundNotion episodes is kind of a
For
running
those
thing.
that are just listening to the audio have no idea what we're talking about. But if you're watching the YouTube video, we have a kitty cameo, which is a common occurrence on SoundNotion.
I think it's interesting how many musicians and composers I know who do have animals and are an integral part of their life. I know I couldn't exist without having actually it's like an alien race living with us, and it's a wonderful experience.
Does your cat enjoy certain kinds of music more than others?
Well, I know that they're not fans of loud drummers and loud bass players, but they have been totally intrigued by flute players that have come over to play duets, acoustic guitar. I had a bassoonist over, and they loved that. Maybe the frequency, the vibrations, I'm sure has something to do with it. Or they just were just digging the move and the grooves of the musicians.
So you kind of touched on this earlier, and sorry to kind of like go back and forth in the conversation, but how did your work on fluid density, or how is your work on fluid density informing this work that you're working on now for the upcoming album?
Excellent question. Well, we don't want to try to repeat that and do the exact same thing. We're looking for other compositions that we are interested in examining in our own kind of way. I know, like the Bad Plus had a very popular release this year on the Rite of Spring, I believe it was, and they tried to do their take of the entire suite. That's not our approach. We're more looking at maybe individual sections or a specific section. Let's say if we were going to do something on the Rite of Spring, and exploring a certain rhythm or a certain harmonic structure or Stravinsky that we love, and explore that and try to personalize it in our own way. So we're doing that with other pieces that we find we have a common interest in, as well as some structures that we're interested in. Tonino has spent the good portion of several years compiling, and he's about to publish. I hope this doesn't sound like a commercial, but he's going to publish a piano exercise book on atonal piano technique. And so he's been compiling an amazing amount of materials that have interested him and he's researched and worked on. And I know that we're going to use some of those materials to use as the basis of structures to improvise and tell a story on between the two of us, as I have also done the same over many years of trying to develop my own personal voice and improvisation, written out studies in all 12 keys and different structures on hexatonic and other scales or different chords. And so it's what the nature of individually we both bring to the table, that we find common grounds, that we say this could make an interesting theme, melodic and harmonic, to investigate and play for people, tell a story to people.
That's really interesting, and it's I don't worry about sounding like a commercial. You know, the plugs are great, and that book sounds wonderful. And when it is released, I would love to seek out a copy, because that sounds like the kind of thing that I would want to check out. But you kind of touched on this in this last answer. If I were thinking about me performing this kind of music, doing the things that you do, I would be concerned that it would get old, if not for the audience, for me, to just show up and do this same improvisation every time, if that makes sense. And so are you continually do you have, like, you know, pieces that you're working on? I know I guess I'm not sure, because the extent to which it's composed seems to be pretty flexible. But how do you show up and say, this is what we're playing today? You know what I mean?
Yes. When we have performed live, which has been numerous times, we do have what we call specific pieces. One is where we both start on the same tone or the same note. Let's say it's concert D flat, and we call it that, starting on the same tone, and it's always different every time. And then we may say, but we're only going to do it for 4 minutes, so we try to keep to that. The next time we do it may be concert F, and we're going to do it for 10 minutes. We might say, but we're going to have a slow portion in it. Or we have this piece where Tonino actually has to wear gloves, because he's using the back of his hand to play against the keys, and he has this technique of doing that. So yes, for lack of a better term, we call it the glove piece, and we both know what that is. And yet,
Not a Michael Jackson reference.
Not at all. He wears them on both hands.
Oh.
And they're not silver. And while there may be elements that are the same about it, every time we've done it, performed it, or just practiced it together, they've been entirely different, and that's important. If they started to say the same every time we did it, we would probably put it away and say, let's not investigate that for a while, or play that. Let's try something new.
This seems like that would be a danger to kind of slide into things that you've done before and that you've played before and that are pretty familiar.
Yes, as an improvisationist, we all have our little cliches, and we always have to be aware of referencing them too much. And I know I have my own, and sometimes when I listen back to recordings, especially older recordings, I start to cringe when I start to hear my little cliches creep in. Sometimes it may be things that I've been recently working on a lot, and so they may definitely portray themselves, creep up in a new recording. the problem is to prevent them from popping up too much, and it's just like that game. You want to take out the hammer and pop them back down in their hole, and just use them sparingly, and to incorporate all the things you've been working on. And so that is why I was taught not to memorize certain things. Have a sense of ability to play in all 12 keys and play things all around your horn in one octave, but not to memorize specific so-called licks. And so that's the danger.
What were you going to ask, Patrick?
If it's called whack-a-mole.
Sure.
So it strikes me, though, that at the same time, those little things are part of what makes your playing yours, and my playing mine, and Nate's playing Nate's. And I wonder if you ever feel like that could go overboard. You know, we say that when we listen to this, it doesn't really strike us as particularly of jazz or particularly of contemporary classical music, but there are definitely little moments, like a jazz trumpet ornament that I catch throughout there all the time, and that's kind of a very bluesy reference thing. And I wonder if those smaller scale things are things that you think about when you're thinking about repeating yourself as well.
I know the instances you're talking about, and actually I didn't mind that they came in to this so-called release, which was more focused on 20th century music compositional technique and performance. Just because when I played them, it wasn't for a lack of drawing on something to play, but I really felt that that's what I wanted to say there. And I don't think I overstated using maybe a bluesy or jazz technique in this recording a lot. It's other little improvisational techniques of series of maybe using fourths or little descending patterns that I felt, I used that a little bit too much. But that's just, I'm always the most critical on myself, and I can't help but doing that. And I think Tonino would say the same thing, that he hears things in his playing that he wish he had not gone to, maybe, per se. But I think that's all improvisational musicians say that. We can't help it. When you listen to a Woody Shaw album, a Miles Davis album, a McCoy Tyner album, you can readily identify their little things that they do that makes them who they are. And
I think that's a good thing.
It is. Yeah. It is. I just want to keep exploring new things and add more things to my repertoire of communicating and telling a story. So I'm always worried that I'm drawing on only too little things, and I'm using too much of the same thing.
Yeah, it almost parallels kind of developing a motivic idea in a composition, is that you can tweak it to the extent that it is no longer recognizable, or you can tweak it so that the audience can kind of hear that progression and that development of the idea through the whole thing. And you kind of work to strike a balance between something that doesn't sound anything like the thing that you heard before and something that sounds like it's a continuation of the thing that you heard before. And how much variety is going to, still make sense as a cohesive unit.
True. It's what we all strive to do, is have an individual voice that is identifiable, and so that is the balance of being who we are and yet not sound the same every time we play. Because then that would be boring, and that would not be improvisation. That would just be a rearrangement of the same technique that you've learned.
And it speaks to the parallel between improvisation and composition, right? Improvisation is basically just composition and performing in much closer proximity to one another than normally.
Oh yes, I for many years I took from Dennis Sandoli in Philadelphia, both composition and improvisation, and he's most famous for being, John Coltrane's teacher, as well as James Moody and many. but he had this concept way back in the late 50s when he first started teaching that if you went to him, that you studied both composition and improvisation, because as he believed, they are both the same thing. You cannot learn one thing without learning the other, that they support each other and are just a continuation of blending of the two. To be a good improvisationist, you have to have and understand compositional technique and understand what are the elements of a specific composition, and vice versa.
Yeah, so let's actually take a little bit of a listen to some of Fluid Density. This is I'm gonna play this from Bandcamp, and I would encourage our audience to go check out Brian's music on Bandcamp. I'm a big fan of Bandcamp as a platform for distributing music, but I want to take a listen to Opposite Geometry, which is on this album, and I think you'll hear, if you've been listening to this and wondering what the heck are these guys talking about, I think it will all make sense in just a moment. So that was a brief excerpt from Opposite Geometry on our guest Brian Groder's album Fluid Density with Tonino. How do you say Tonino's last name? Tonino Miano? Okay,
Miano.
so Tonino Miano on piano. And is that one of the glove pieces that you were mentioning?
Exactly. Very good.
I also wanted to bring it out because it has a few of those little those jazz trumpet ornaments that I mentioned earlier, but it's definitely its own thing. It is of jazz and it is of classical music, and it is not really completely either of them, which is a really interesting space. And there are a lot of people exploring it. I'm glad that it is becoming a more popular place to play around. But it's very beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Oh yeah. In performance, we have taken some Ornette Coleman compositions and used that as a basis of exploration, and not play it as a jazz improvisation, but to do it in this sense of style of 20th century techniques. We've also been exploring using graphic scores and other alternative music notation that we're both interested in. And Tonino has more of a history of doing that with his other recordings with other instrumentalists using graphic scores and alternative notations. I had a piece, or I should say, I had some introduction to that through the wonderful bassist Lyle Ellis, who performed with Cecil Taylor in the 70s and the 80s, and his system of notations, which opened up to a whole range of possibilities and learning techniques that I was unfamiliar with, that I had not been introduced into music school. And so it just, I'm totally interested in it, and I know that that's going to be some of the new basis of recording, this new recording that Tonino and I are investigating.
And you mentioned music school and the different kind of notation that you've been able to explore and work with in your time doing music. I was particularly interested poking around your website. You've got a section called the woodshed, and this is a term that mostly my jazz friends growing up that they used for like go to the woodshed and spend all that time working out the new ideas and practicing. And I'm familiar with and many of our listeners and viewers might be familiar with how you go about learning classical music. Like you work on technique, you work on scales, you work on different pieces, and then in jazz you work on doing transcriptions, you work with playing in the harmonies and doing different work like this. I was curious, and on your website there's a wonderful collection that you've got of different materials for going through different scales and different techniques and exercises and etudes. I was wondering, for the particular kind of music that you do, like how you went about learning to do this kind of thing, or how you might point a student in the direction of exploring this kind of music.
Well, we are lucky. There is bountiful resources of materials that are on the internet that people can order to read and also to practice from. Source materials, suggested listening to recordings of famous composers and performers that people can listen to specifically to get a sense. To be, in my opinion, to be a good musician, you need to be constantly listening, expanding your horizons, and listening to new music that is being released, as well as older compositions and composers, and to revisit them and listen to them in new ways that you haven't listened to them in the past. So I try to listen to music every day.
Yeah.
And there is, multiple sources. Through Facebook, people are posting music that's important to them. We do go to YouTube, or just go to your own music library of CDs or LPs, or for those people that have cassettes still, or if you're lucky enough to have a good library system. In New York City, we actually have a wonderful music library that one can go and listen to, have music sent to them and take out. And then if you are really serious at any level, to actually study with someone who can guide you and make suggestions, and to be brutally honest with you and say, you're not doing this, or you need to do this, have you considered this? To make those comparisons and suggestions is very important. It's very difficult to do it in a sterile environment, just to blaze ahead. But if you have information coming to you, especially by a mentor that can help you and shape what you're trying to achieve, is extremely important. I mentioned Dennis Sandoli, who was fantastic in helping me hear and perceive new ideas. The other person I spent many years studying under is Joanne Brackeen, here in New York City, who is primarily known as a jazz artist. but who also has this wonderful interest and ability to play in many styles on the piano, who also incorporates different elements of non-jazz in her playing. And so I mostly studied composition with her, and she helped shape and direct me in continuing my own investigations. When I would bring something back, an assignment, and she would say, "This is wonderful," and then hand it back to me and say, "But you've already done that. Look at it a different way." Or what happens if you rearrange the elements of this composition and just reshuffle them? Or she say, "Well, the most interesting thing about this composition is these 4 measures." She goes, "I would put the other measures that you've done very well in the bank," she would call it, "and redo your composition based on these 4 measures because they're the strongest." And that concept of the bank, I continually use. I try to write something every day. Not all of it is obviously good or good enough or strong enough, but I don't throw it away. I put it in that notebook that I'm saving, and at some point you go to that as a reference. You may actually remember, "Oh, I did something like this. What did I do? What can I use from it? Or what can I learn from that?" And sometimes you can use that in a new way, and that's why you saved it. And it's just a good way of looking back and going, "Oh my goodness, did I really write that back then?"
Yeah.
And say, I'm so happy that I don't do that anymore. Or it's a continual daily progress, and that's the exciting part. One of the exciting parts of being a musician and a composer is that you continually grow. You continually grow, and listening to others are a source of inspiration, and saying, "I really respect what she or he did. How would I do that?" And sometimes I go home and say, "How would I write that composition? How would I articulate that in my voice? Or how do I want to do that?" And that's valid. I think that's valid. You're not copying someone. You're using those people as an inspiration for your own art.
Yeah, I think that's a good. I always ask my composition students when they listen to music to listen for things that they think that they would, some elements that they would want to incorporate into their music. But there are probably, in any music that you listen to, there are going to be some of those elements, but then there are also going to be elements that you definitely want to avoid. And in even the most extremely loved and extremely hated pieces, you can probably find both. Right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it is good as a teacher to give those assignments. I know Joanne once said, "All right, I want you to do 16 measures of something that Brad Meldau would play as a middle section to this piece that you're working on. It really needs a middle section that's sort of like in a Bach way, but a modern take." And she says, use Brad as an introduction to that. And so that made me listen to a lot of his music and transcribe some of his voicings, and then study that, and then try to do it, but in my own way. And that was very, very helpful. And she did that with other people, other composers. And so that's good for students to then listen to specific composers, performers in a specific way, to use their materials, but then put it in your own writing and performance technique, without studying multiple, a long length on one individual artist. And so you can hear what a student is doing and saying, "Oh, I see what you're trying to reference," or maybe listen to this person and see what you can take from what they do and use it in how you want to compose.
That's really interesting, and it's interesting talking to you about this, how similar composition and improvisation really are, and we often think of them as different disciplines, but they're really pretty much the same. One of them just requires you to play an instrument a lot better.
Yes and no. I to me, my father often would say the hardest thing to play is something that is at a slow tempo, because the listener has enough space around everything you're doing to evaluate how well you're doing it, the attack, the release, your tone, what story you're telling. And then, of course, if you're performing something they know, that's even harder. That is why singing the national anthem in a stadium is so terrifying for so many people, because it is a difficult performance. It's not necessarily a fast performance, and everyone knows it. And so when you improvise slowly on a ballad, or it doesn't have to be a jazz idiom, anything slow, but you're improvising on it, the listener can almost hear your own inner mechanisms, going through what you're picking and choosing to improvise based upon, and the story you're telling. And that is a very difficult thing to do. If you're playing a lot of notes and it's a fast tempo, the listener is moving on that wave and may not hear some of the things that have gone before that what you consider would not be considered successful as far as what you wanted to play at that moment. And of course, that leads up to the famous quote, I don't know if it was Miles Davis or so, but said there are no wrong notes. It's just how you resolve them and make them, incorporate them into the structure of what your theme that you're playing at the moment.
That's interesting. It's one of those things that you hear all the time when people talk about improvisation, but in a lot of ways, it's absolutely true. And maybe that's a good place to leave it for our discussion for now. We have a few news stories we want to talk about. And to start with, just last night as we're recording this, the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra had a concert last night that was actually interrupted by protesters, which is not something that you hear about all the time in orchestral music, though seemingly we've had a few of them in the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about protests at the death of Klinghoffer, or at the Metropolitan Opera around the death of Klinghoffer. And then again last night, this was not necessarily a protest of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra, but several people stood up after intermission as the orchestra was about to begin performing Brahms' German Requiem, and they started singing the civil rights hymn, "Which Side Are You On?" And there were banners that were unfurled from the dress circle over into the hall, and they were protesting the resolution of the Michael Brown killing in Ferguson, Missouri, nearby Ferguson, Missouri, and they sang. They interrupted the performance and also the radio broadcast of the performance, which is really interesting. And Alex Ross has actually posted the audio from the radio broadcast. I'm going to play a little bit of that. Actually, you know what? I don't have that queued up on the right computer. So I will not play any of that. But we will link to it, and you should check it out. The people in the hall are a little stunned. It's not the sort of thing that you expect to happen when you go to an orchestra concert. And the radio broadcasters kind of just sit and let it happen for almost a minute before they say anything. And then they start explaining what's going on. And right at the end, there's a really delightful kind of exchange is not the right word because they're not talking to one another, but there's a guy in the hall who is clearly not one of the protesters as the people are leaving, and they seem to have left on their own. It seems like they said their piece and walked out. Very, very gentlemanly protest. They said their piece and walked out, and the St. Louis Symphony says that they weren't, kicked out, and they weren't they didn't have to call security or the cops or anything. But somebody in the audience shouts, and you can hear it at the end of this clip from Alex Ross, "Let's have some real music." And the guy, the radio announcer, says something really nice. He says, "That was also some real music." And so there was some passionate people, and there was some real music in the hall singing that civil rights hymn, and now there will be just not better music but different music.
Exciting times.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's exciting to think that somebody would think that an orchestra is a reasonable place to have a political protest.
Right.
Yes, a communication between society members, and using music as a bridge for that, or a basis of or platform for that. That's exciting. That's exciting.
I mean, I don't think I've ever been to an orchestra concert or a classical music concert of any kind that had any kind of political protest. Have any of you?
I have, well, in the hall.
Yeah, in the hall like that.
Yes, I have.
Really?
I went to a couple years ago. I went to the Israel Philharmonic.
Oh,
Gala.
Was this the part of the Spring for Music thing?
No. Every year, the Israel Philharmonic holds a gala at Carnegie Hall, which is hosted. It's a benefit event, and there are always protesters, and some of them sometimes make it into the hall and start passing out flyers. This generally happens before any performance starts, though. But as people are sitting down and things, you'll see some people start passing stuff out.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the St. Louis Symphony was very clear at this. These people were ticket buyers. I assume they sat through the first half of the concert and just waited patiently for their moment to do their thing before the German Requiem, which was, I think, a nice place for it. One of them said something as they were leaving, like, "Where's the Requiem for Michael Brown?" And then they left, and I don't know. It's a really interesting story, and be interested to see if the St. Louis Symphony decides to be any more involved than that in this process. There apparently were members of the orchestra and chorus applauding the protesters as they left. Not everyone, obviously, but some of them, and that's pretty neat to see.
Yeah.
Also in the news, and unfortunately, sadly, we do have to mention at least a little bit about the Atlanta Symphony situation, as I always regret doing. So last Saturday, orchestra management announced that that sides had agreed to work with a federal mediator. And that was news to the musicians who had agreed to consider a federal mediator and maybe talk to a federal mediator about coming in, but had not agreed to the actual mediation, which is what the orchestra had announced that they had agreed to. And a few days after that, we have no idea if this was part of what caused it. The CEO of the Atlanta Symphony resigned. There is a new interim CEO, and he will not be involved in the negotiations, which is probably makes sense since he probably won't be there for most of the collective bargaining agreement's existence. So they are still not playing, and there are still a lot of frustrated members of the orchestra board who is bizarrely sitting in this, as we've discussed, kind of in this weird space where they don't have a ton of power because they're underneath the Woodruff Arts Center's executive committee. So we'll see how that plays out. Still kind of a bummer that one of the few orchestras in the United States that is pretty well known for being more adventurous in their programming is not playing this season, and probably doesn't look like they're going to be playing anytime soon. So we will let you know when there is anything else worth knowing about that. I don't think that there is a ton worth knowing about American orchestras these days, but that's one thing. And I think that'll probably do it. Do we want to mention the LA Insight series? We'll pass on that. We're running a little on the long side today. But Brian, thank you so much for your time this morning. Do you have anything coming up that you want to plug before we sign off?
No, I just ask everyone to do what they do in embracing new music from any source they can, and make those comparisons and put together weird playlists. It's an amazing thing to do. It's one of the benefits from the old cassette days of putting together weird cassette playlists, and to do that on CDs. And I think it gives a freshness to music and jumping of genres, and I encourage people to do that all the time. to seek out new musicians and new music that they haven't heard before. It's literally a world of music that most of us are unfamiliar with, and there's always something good to listen to.
And where should people go if they want to follow up with you and check out more of your stuff?
My website, briangroder.com, and of course the Bandcamp. And I have several releases there that you can listen to music. And the other portions that were mentioned, the woodshop and the woodshed, I should say, and solo transcriptions. And there will soon be one transcription of one of the duets between Tonino and myself. Mm-hmm. So you can actually see the relationship of us playing together. And things like that, that other musicians that are doing that's exciting. Downloading compositions that so you can play them yourselves, and that's what music in this century should be all about, of people participating in it themselves with their favorite musicians and composers.
Do you ever use Last.fm?
No, I haven't. It's funny that you mentioned that. Someone else was talking to me about that earlier this week. I think it might have been Tonino.
It's a really cool thing. If you're not familiar with Last.fm, it's a service that you sign up for, and you can download a little application that runs on your computer and or plugs into your iTunes or Spotify or whatever you like to listen to on, and it tracks all of the things that you're listening to on all of the different ways that you listen to them, so you can go back and look at what you've listened to. And then also, if someone allows it, you can follow people whose musical taste you like or are interested in, and you can see what the people that you are in your kind of musical community are listening to as well. So I could say, hey, I like Nate's taste in music, and I want to follow him on Last.fm just the same way you'd follow somebody on Twitter, and it'll plop out every time Nate listens to a track. If I go to Last.fm, I can see what he's been listening to. It's a really cool thing for discovering new kinds of music that you wouldn't ordinarily discover based on, presumably recommendations from, if only implicit recommendations from friends.
Yes, very cool. One of the wonderful benefits of new technology that consumers can use that they can enjoy.
Yeah, so find people on Last.fm. Find your friends on Last.fm. That would be my takeaway recommendation. And that is going to do it for this week's SoundNotion. We thank everyone for watching live or listening live or watching or listening after the fact. You can find links to all of the things we talked about, including all of Brian's excellent projects, on our site in our show notes at soundnotion.tv/SN for all of the information about this particular show. And you can find us stuff about all of our other shows there as well. You can connect with us on Facebook or YouTube or Twitter. If you'd like to suggest things that we discuss on the show, you can tweet us with #SNWeekly, and we always check that out as we're putting the show together. You can use the contact form on our site to get in touch with us as well. You can subscribe to this show and all our shows at soundnotion.tv in the iTunes Store or wherever you get your podcasts aggregated, and subscribe to them in your favorite podcatchers on your favorite podcatching platforms. If you'd like to support the show, you can do that using our Amazon affiliate search. It's a little search box on the right side of our site. It doesn't cost you anything, but if you're just buying stuff on Amazon anyway, if you search for it and find it through our little search box, we get a little commission on that, and that helps us out a lot. It doesn't cost you anything, but it is very helpful. Thanks to those who've done that. If you'd like to support us more directly, we have donation links through PayPal as well. SoundNotion's introduction includes music by Patrick Gullo. Hey there, Patrick.
Hey.
Thanks for that music.
You're
welcome.
That was
very nice of you.
It's a pleasure to do it.
Thank you so much for watching or listening, and we will see you back next week.